Professor John Lennox is a pure mathematician by vocation. Originally from Northern Ireland, his academic career has taken him first to Cardiff and then to Oxford. He is currently Professor Emeritus of the Institute of Mathematics at the University of Oxford. He is author of a number of books, many of which are on our bookstall in the Mezzanine, and I encourage you to visit that at the end of the evening. Books such as Gunning for God, How the New Atheists Are Missing the Target. One that I have particularly enjoyed, God's Undertaker, is also there. Can also commend his website to you, where there are lots of resources of talks that he has given and debates that he's had in universities and cities around the world, and that is johnlennox.org. He has debated with leading atheists such as Richard Dawkins, Peter Singer, and the late Christopher Hitchens. He has taught all over the world, particularly in Eastern Europe. And so, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to welcome back to Belfast Professor John Lennox.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Are you sitting comfortably? So am I. I've traveled a great deal in the former Soviet Union, and I was intrigued to discover when I got to Siberia that the professors sat to teach. And then upon reflection, I recalled that it's a very good biblical precedent, sitting to teach. And so in my old age and with diminishing strength, I have made a virtue out of necessity. So I shall, with your permission, sit this evening. It has been a great honor for me to be invited to give the Walton Lectures 2017. And it's also a great honor to be at an event of this kind in my home country. I was looking back, and I think this must be the first time I have lectured to a crowd like this in Belfast. And thank you so much for coming. It demonstrates what I see all around the world, that these questions are enormously important still. And you are proving no exception this evening. And thanks to Queen's CU, they have worked very hard, otherwise you wouldn't be here, and I certainly wouldn't be here. And David Montgomery and his team. I'm going to start with Walton because it may not be something everyone here knows, but Ireland does have one Nobel Prize winner for science. It has several others in literature, but only one for science, and that is E.T.S. Walton. Walton was a genius who studied in Dublin, went to Cambridge, and with Sir John Cockcroft, he split the atom. And it is said of Walton, he was the first man to see an atom splitting, whatever the word see means in that context. And Walton was a Christian. And subsequently, he would say things like this: one way to learn the mind of the Creator is to study his creation. We must pay God the compliment of studying his work of art, and this should apply to all realms of human thought. A refusal to use our intelligence honestly is an act of contempt for him who gave us that intelligence. And it's a beautiful picture for a scientist studying the natural world to regard it as a work of art. In other words, it doesn't simply exist per se. It is a creation. And because we are made in the image of the Creator, we have got minds to study it with. Of course, that conflicts head-on with the notion that the creation is a product not of an intelligence, but of the basic stuff of the universe, which is usually regarded as the atomic particles and some variations on that theme. The philosopher Massimo Pigliucci says the basic assumption of science is that the world can be explained entirely in physical terms without recourse to godlike entities. And there you have starkly the two views. For Walton, science is studying a work of art by an intelligent creator. For Pigliucci, science is the commitment to an explanation exhaustively in terms of atoms, physical terms. Now, of course, the atomic hypothesis has been remarkably successful. It was a brilliant idea. It still is a brilliant idea. And Richard Feynman, who won the Nobel Prize for Physics, used to say, if all science were lost and only one result of science were retained to pass on to future generations, it would have to be the atomic hypothesis, that all things are made of atoms, little particles that move around in perpetual motion, attracting each other when they are a little distance apart, but repelling upon being squeezed into one another. It was a brilliant insight. It goes back to Democritus and Leucippus. And Democritus wrote, by convention is sweet, by convention bitter, by convention hot, by convention cold, but by verity, that is in actual fact, it is atoms and the void. And these ancient thinkers reduced reality, ultimate reality, to two things: the atoms flowing through the void. And so their concept of explanation was to explain everything bottom up in terms of the activities of these atoms in empty space. Now, of course, it's become much more sophisticated and brilliantly successful. People have studied atoms, Democritus, and then you go to John Dalton's atomic theory, subatomic theories with their electrons, protons, and neutrons, quantum theory, the standard model of the universe, and most recently, the Higgs boson and quantum gravity. All of that has been a spin-off from the original idea of the atom, atomos, the thing that cannot be cut or divided. And of course, the void has been studied in various ways. Newton with his gravitation, Faraday, Clerk Maxwell with their electromagnetic fields, Einstein with gravitational fields, and all of that brilliantly successful and generally accepted as the best description that we have. So what we're facing is this, that the atomic hypothesis has got a huge amount going for it, for which we are all very grateful, because a lot of this work has resulted in all the electronic gadgetry that I hope you've all switched off at this particular point. And so what we're left with now is the dominance, not of Walton's position, but of Dawkins' position. And here he's talking about explanation. My task is to explain elephants and the world of complex things in terms of the simple things that physicists can either understand or are working on. I am rather amused at the fact that he thinks quantum electrodynamics might be simple. Beyond physical reductionism, you have psychological reductionism. This is Francis Crick, also a Nobel Prize winner. You, your joys and sorrows, your memories and ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. So it's not simply the physical universe, it's a psychological universe. Mind is reducible to matter exhaustively, and in the end, all the things that we value are actually simply motions of the basic chemicals, nerve cells, atoms in our bodies. Now, one of the results of the spectacular success of the natural sciences is the idea that is very common now that we call scientism. Scientism just means, says Alex Rosenberg, whom I debated, he's a philosopher in the United States, Being scientistic just means treating science as our exclusive guide to reality, to nature, both our own nature and everything else. Now, this is another twist. This is not simply saying that everything reduces to atoms and the void. This is saying that there's a single guide to understanding everything, and that is the natural sciences. Nothing else works. Now, of course, you only have to think for a minute to see that that is absurd. Indeed, if it were true, half the faculties in Queen's University would have to close tomorrow. There'd be no history, there'd be no economics, there'd be no literature, there'd be no languages, there'd be no music, and so on. It is overkill. But the trouble is, it's a dangerous idea because it is espoused by some of the leading thinkers of the day, notably Stephen Hawking and Richard Dawkins. We need to balance that up very clearly by referring to Sir Peter Medawar, also a Nobel Prize winner. And he is very straight. He said, the existence of a limit to science is, however, made clear by its inability to answer childlike elementary questions having to do with first and last things. Questions such as, how did everything begin? What are we all here for? What is the point of living? He could see that the natural sciences cannot answer these questions. And just to ram that home, let's go to another brilliant physicist who worked in Ireland for a time, Erwin Schrödinger. I am very astonished, he wrote, that the scientific picture of the real world around me is very deficient. It gives a lot of factual information, puts all our experience in a magnificently consistent order, but is ghastly silent about all and sundry that is really near to our heart, that really matters to us. It cannot tell us a word about red and blue, bitter and sweet, physical pain and physical delight. It knows nothing of beautiful and ugly, good or bad, God and eternity. Science sometimes pretends to answer questions in these domains, but the answers are very often so silly that we are not inclined to take them seriously. Now, if we stand back from all of this, the result of the pressure from the reductionists, from people like Richard Dawkins, and from scientism is that many people in the public, in the UK and around the world, particularly in the West, feel that there's been a historic battle between science and faith in God. Science is won, and we might as well forget God and certainly not do God in the public space. I want to challenge that very profoundly. I think it's superficial, extremely superficial, to think that we are dealing with science versus God, because we're not actually. And we can illustrate it very simply. If we take Walton, since we're thinking about him, he was a brilliant physicist. He won the Nobel Prize. Peter Higgs did exactly the same a few years ago, and he won the Nobel Prize. So what divides these men is certainly not their physics. They're both at the very top of physics. But Higgs is an atheist, and Walton is a Christian. So that we see their differentiation doesn't come about at the level of their science at all. It comes about at the level of their worldview. That is the big framework through which they look at everything. Higgs looks at it through an atheist framework. Walton through a theistic framework, a Christian framework. And we all, ladies and gentlemen, have a worldview. And usually it falls into one of three families: theism, atheism, or pantheism. And so I think the real question is, where does science fit in all of this? What is the relationship between science and worldview? Does science lead logically to theism? Or does it lead to the various versions of atheism? Or does it lead nowhere? Is it completely neutral? And it's a very important question to ask. Because one of the reasons a lot of the atheism put out by Dawkins and Hawking and so on remains unchallenged is because of their scientific authority. And I want to state a principle, and it's a very important one. Not every statement by a scientist is a statement of science. Often they're simply stating what they believe, what is their worldview. Now let's give a couple of examples of the two extremes here. George Klein, again, won the Nobel Prize. I am not an agnostic. I am an atheist. But look at this next bit. My attitude is not based on science. He's not claiming, as Dawkins would, that his atheism leads to his science. No, but rather on faith. The absence of a creator, the non-existence of God is my childhood faith, my adult belief, unshakable and holy. Now this shocks some people to realize that some of the top thinkers are committed atheists long before they get involved in science. But that has a corollary, and it is that they will look at science through atheist spectacles. All of us look at the world through colored spectacles, and we need to recognize that. The opposite extreme is the father of modern astronomy, Alan Sandage, who for many years was an atheist but became a Christian in middle age. And he wrote, I find it quite improbable that such order came out of chaos. There has to be some organizing principle. God for me is a mystery, but is the explanation for the miracle of existence, why there is something rather than nothing. The Crawford Prize, by the way, is the equivalent of the Nobel Prize for astronomy. To sum this up, I find the words of one of the world's most distinguished philosophers very apt. Alvin Plantinga says this: firstly, the alleged conflict between science and theism is superficial. There is real concord. But it's the second thing that is fascinating. The alleged concord between science and atheism is superficial. There is real conflict. And now, to be a little more provocative in case you go to sleep, our title is Cosmic Chemistry. Do science and God mix? And I'm going to argue, yes, they do very well. But I'm going to argue that science and atheism do not mix. And that might, again, surprise some of my listeners. But we'll come to that anon. It's always very important, especially if you're a scientist or a mathematician like me, to learn history. I am very keen on the humanities, by the way, just in case half my audience happen to be keen on the humanities. I am too. Languages and literature and all the rest of it. But history as a discipline is vitally important in navigating the contemporary debate on these issues. So let's go through a little bit. Think of the rise of modern science. Galileo, Kepler, Newton, and so on. All of them believers in God. Perhaps a mathematician likes best Kepler's statement: the chief aim of all investigations of the external world should be to discover the rational order which has been imposed on it by God and which he revealed to us in the language of mathematics. That's very much like Walton's statement. And of course, the greatest of all in the past, probably Isaac Newton. It seems probable to me that God in the beginning formed matter in solid, massy, hard, impenetrable, movable particles. He wasn't rejecting the atomic hypothesis. But what he was doing is offering a reason why there was a universe there at all. Because the atomic hypothesis, the one thing it does not explain is the existence of atoms in the first place. And we may come back to that. Newton said, don't doubt the Creator, because it is inconceivable that accidents alone could be the controller of this universe. Now we've had Walton, an Irishman, Newton, an Englishman, so let's have a Scotsman. James Clerk Maxwell, often called the Scottish Einstein, inscribed on the door of the laboratory where Walton and Cockcroft split the atom are the words, still, great are the works of the Lord to be studied by all who take delight in them. The point to be made here is very simple. That not only monotheism, but the Christian faith played a key role, according to most historians of science, in the rise of science itself. And the reason given, well stated by C.S. Lewis, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in the lawgiver. Now, if anything gives the lie to the myth that science and God are in conflict, it is this. You see, faith in God didn't inhibit the rise of modern science. It was actually, arguably, the motor that drove it. And sometimes I put it this way: I'm not remotely ashamed of being both a scientist and a Christian, because arguably it was Christianity that gave me my subject. So there's huge historic concord. Hence the shock when the newspapers read like this: Stephen Hawking, arguably the most famous living scientist, a genius. I remember him at Cambridge. He was just ahead of me in terms of age, but he's light years ahead of me in his brain power as a mathematician and theoretical physicist. And at the end of his book, A Brief History of Time, which is often described as the most unread book in history, because people have it on their coffee tables and they get to page 3 and then they turn to something else. But he left a space open for God, and he talked about the mind of God. But he has much more recently come to clearly state that he is an atheist. And this was the Times headline: Hawking, God did not create the universe. Now, in order to keep things pretty snappy and to keep moving, I want to focus on this because it raises a huge question. Because Stephen Hawking, you see, occupied the same chair at Cambridge as Isaac Newton, the Lucasian chair. And here is Newton, who discovered the law of gravitation and actually used it as an argument for believing in God. When he discovered gravitation, he didn't say, I've got an explanation, I don't need God. What he said was, what a genius of a God to do it that way. And here's Hawking, his successor in the Lucasian chair, who studies gravitation and who uses gravitation as a reason for not believing in God. So I hope that focuses the problem. How is it that Newton uses it pro and Hawking uses it contra? Hawking's reason, by the way, is, and this is the heart of his book, this is the central argument of his book, the grand design. Because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. So that's his statement. Here's the question: how do we get from Newton's theism to Hawking's atheism?